So thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to Better with Age. This is a speaker series that we have been putting on through the month of June for Seniors Month. My name is Jenna Wickens and I am the Mature Minds Coordinator with Catholic Family Services of Simcoe County. Thank you for joining us. You'll notice that your camera and your microphone have been turned off and muted. We do ask that you use the chat and the question and answer. We would love to hear from you, but we do ask that you don't record or take pictures of the presentation. The presentation is being recorded and we hope to make that available to anyone who is interested. Today we are coming to you, I'm coming to you from Barrie. Dr. Willimon is somewhere else. I'm not even sure where, but from our offices in Barrie, we just want to give a land acknowledgement. So we want to welcome all visiting community members. This building is located on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. CFSSC respects Indigenous history and culture and is dedicated to moving forward in the process of reconciliation with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. So thank you again for joining us. We are so delighted that you are here. We are delighted that we can learn together. We like to say that growing old is an opportunity to grow. And if things are growing, they're living, they're thriving. So as Catholic Family Services, who we are is we are an organization providing help, offering hope, and changing lives. We do this through counseling and community development. I work in the community development side. We also have counseling for anyone who might be in need of those supports. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker. This is Dr. Willimon, and he is joining us to speak about aging and spirituality. The Reverend Dr. William H. Willimon is professor of the practice of Christian ministry at the Divinity School, Duke University. He served 8 years as bishop of the North Alabama Conference of the United Methodist Church, where he led the 157,000 Methodists and 792 pastors in North Alabama. He's the author of roughly 100 books. His worship as pastoral care was selected as one of the 10 most useful books for pastors in 1979 by the Academy of Parish Clergy. Over 1 million copies of his books have been sold. In 1996, an international survey conducted by Baylor University named him one of the 12 most effective preachers in the English-speaking world. And we are so grateful that Dr. Will Willimon is here with us. He wrote a book called Aging, Growing Old in Church, and I read this and just loved it. Laughed out loud, had moments too where I was just had those light bulbs go off of realizing aging and value for older adults and aging, and the combination of all those things. So Dr. Will Willimon, I'm going to hand it off to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it is the floor, so to speak, is yours.
Hey, thank you, Jen. Great to be with you. Greetings from North Carolina. It's very hot here today. Maybe even hot up across the border, for all I know. Great to be with you and to think about aging. I was asked to write this book and to think about aging from a Christian perspective. I realize that everybody listening may not be a Christian, but my goal was to look upon aging as an interesting journey that we make and with spiritual significance, and tried to ponder that. So that's my perspective in trying to think about this. When Christians think about any subject, generally we think with scripture, we look through the lens of the Bible. And so I started out trying to look at what does the Bible seem to say about aging, what role does it play in scripture? First thing you notice is there's not a whole lot about aging in scripture, which may be a nice reminder that aging, as we're experiencing it, I had my 76th birthday last week. But aging, as we're experiencing it, is a very new phenomenon. Through most of human history, something like retirement, completely unknown. Aging was a rare thing, and in Scripture, like in the Old Testament, aging is portrayed as a particular gift of God. A sign of a long life is a sign of a well-lived life, and you have people living to allegedly spectacular age, Methuselah and people over 100 and this kind of thing, but rare. Jesus Christ, for instance, his life was terminated at 33, and we think of that as he was a young man. We used to sing in my church, "Oh, young and fearless prophet." However, when Jesus was crucified at 33, scholars, anthropologists estimate that the lifespan of a Near Eastern male, 40, would have been considered aged. That would be considered toward the end of your life. The average lifespan was very early 40s. So there ain't a lot in Scripture about aging because there weren't many aging. You look like at the Old Testament, and the Old Testament I found is kind of ambivalent about aging, in that aging is considered to be a blessing of God, a sign of a well-lived life, which maybe is a nice reminder to us to remember that the majority of the human race, during the majority of the history of the human race, would have considered to be able to live past 60 a great blessing, an unusual boon from God. And the aged are seen as a kind of source of wisdom. However, in Scripture too, there's a kind of counter testimony, and I thought of the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, Koheleth. Ecclesiastes, there in that passage, which is often considered poetic. I remember when I was in college, the song by the Kinks or by the Birds or something, turn, for everything there's a season, and for everything under heaven there's a time to build up and a time to pull down. There's a time to be born, there's a time to die. Well, we don't generally go on with that passage. And if you go on with that passage in Scripture, you find that Ecclesiastes says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Think about God when you're young. And that's good advice. But then Ecclesiastes goes on to say, you better think about God during your youth, because let me tell you, when you get older, and in fact it says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come. Evil days, not a very rosy picture of aging. Before the evil days come, when the grinders cease, that is, the teeth are gone. When you wake up at the sound of a bird, older people have trouble sleeping late. You wake up earlier than you'd like to wake up. When the strong men tremble, your legs start to shake, and desire fails. When many of the passions that you had in earlier life, you lose. So my point is, in Scripture, there is a somber, if you will, negative view of aging, or maybe we ought to call it a realistic view, an honest view. One thing you note, when you look at depictions of aging in like media, it's often ambivalent too. On the one hand, and my wife and I noticed this particularly on the evening news, it's brought to you basically by pharmaceutical companies peddling medicines for older people. And so old age is seen as a time of multiple illness. And yet buy this drug so you won't have to suffer with this particular disability, etc. But along with that, I notice we go out to a drama series that we have here in town with musicals and things. And in the program, much of the program are advertisements for retirement places, retirement villages, etc. And that tells you something about the median age of the people who go to the productions at this series. But those advertisements are always pictures of people, of a couple on bicycles, somebody swimming, somebody else skydiving, and hey, come to Golden Acres, a retirement center. These are the best years of your life. Well, the truth of the matter is that's not an accurate picture of most of aging either, that there are predictable challenges of aging. And so I give Scripture credit for being ambivalent or for being honest. You get to the New Testament, there just ain't a lot of older people in the New Testament. And however, you get something like the Gospel of Luke that begins with the story of the infant Jesus, and most of our information about Jesus as a baby, all of our Christmas things come from the Gospel of Luke. And yet the Gospel of Luke begins with older people, Simeon and Anna, Elizabeth and Zechariah. These are presented as older adults, aged people, but also aged people who have unusual insights into the future. They are presented as prophets. They are the ones who, when a baby John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, is given to one of them, sings, Simeon sings, that this is a sign, the birth of this child is a sign of a new age, a dawning of deliverance for God's people. And so aged is presented there as sometimes older people have particular insights into the future. They have experiences, maybe they maybe are more spiritually attuned. They are presented as people who kind of have spirit-driven insights. And so that's interesting. One biblical commentator says it's fascinating. The Gospel of Luke begins with testimonials, visions, prophecies by Simeon and Anna, Elizabeth and Zechariah. And then we never hear from them again, and says, maybe that's what older adults ought to aspire to do. Share your wisdom, give your insights, and then leave. Step aside, let the kids have it, which it is also an interesting commentary there. So I would, trying to think about aging as a Christian, one is I did find a lot of the literature and research going on about aging, and it's voluminous. The field of gerontology was virtually unknown just 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now it is a huge field of research and growing, and that's here you might be interested in some things I found interesting. For instance, I found that there's a lot of myths of aging that are just not backed up by the research. A lot of statements that you often hear, such as, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Older people, creatures of habit, they can't change, they don't change. Well, research shows that older people are majority are perfectly capable of learning new things. In fact, many of them enjoy the years of aging specifically for that reason, as a grand opportunity to finally learn to play the piano, or finally learn French, or finally go on a trip to places I've never been to before. I know one thing, one myth of aging is choose your parents wisely, that your aging is determined by your biology. That is your destiny. The doctor asks you, how old are your parents when they died? And that is supposed to be revealing. Well, it turns out that's not the case, that most of us are aging better than our parents, and that many of us are showing that that our parents' health does not determine our health, mentally, physically, and maybe even spiritually. The little decision, for instance, not to be a smoker, like your parents, becomes a huge decision. Was talking to a woman the other day, and she was talking about how much she was enjoying her club membership and traveling with friends and going out with friends, mostly women her age, older women. And she said, I watched my mother age alone, and I thought, I'm not going to do that. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of research into aging has been the huge importance of socialization on successful aging. That, in fact, my wife noted when she went for her physical this year, the doctor asked her, how often do you talk on the telephone during the course of a day? How many friends do you keep in weekly contact with? Doctor had never asked those questions before. And then the doctor said, do you attend church? Are you a member of a club? You just said, wow, this is fascinating. A doctor would ask these questions. Well, one study says loneliness, solitude in aging, no social interactions, are the equivalent of being a regular smoker. that loneliness takes as many years off your life, so far as longevity is concerned, as smoking. Wow, I find that just fascinating. And other myths of aging are that people's mental capacities decline when they're aging. Studies show that older people on the whole think and can process information well. One thing the studies do seem to indicate is that it takes us longer to think through things, that we don't readily recall things as quickly and process as quickly. However, the end result appears to be just about as good after 80 as it is before 50. And so Alzheimer's, for instance, there's that sense, it is a huge issue. Dementia is a huge issue, putting a huge stress on the healthcare system. Greater stresses, there is real worry about how we're going to manage that. But it's important to remember that basically only like 3 or 4% of people over 80 will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's and dementia. And so it's still a relatively small number. And just read a book by a Yale researcher, a doctor. And I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but here I can't. And I'm not going to say senior moment, because a basic thesis of the book is how you age is very much dependent on your attitudes toward aging. And many of your attitudes toward aging have been impressed on you through a society that is ageist, that in so many ways is prejudiced against and ignorant of the truths about aging. And for instance, the phrase senior moment, she documents when that phrase was invented about 40 years ago. And she talks about that older people who say, my memory is as good as it's ever been, when they are studied along with older people who say, yeah, I'm forgetful these days. I just have these senior moments. I walk into a room and I forget, that your memory is worse if you think your memory is worse. Your memory is better if you think, I think my memory is just as good as it was. Anyway, her book is really stresses that positive attitudes about aging. I don't think she would call them positive as much as she would say accurate, truthful concepts of aging are a powerful factor on aging. And she ends her book by advocating that older people should organize, that we should look at the ways that medical care is often denied older people, or medical care is very different for older people because of prejudices within the medical profession. For instance, I didn't know that Alzheimer was an Austrian physician who diagnosed Alzheimer's, thus his name was given to the illness, that diagnosed it in the early 1900s. And yet he documented it well, and he did studies of brain, dissection of brains, and he basically nailed it. He basically found out the cause of Alzheimer's with this plaque forming in the brain and all, and published it, and yet couldn't get anybody to be interested in his work because basically the medical establishment said older people suffer from dementia. It's called aging. It's not a disease. It's called aging. It's normal. And basically the Alzheimer's research was not picked up again until the 1970s, which is when I first, as a pastor, heard about Alzheimer's and all. So anyway, I find that fascinating. And other insights that impressed me were things like that exercise when aging makes a big difference. And in fact, exercise, in a sense, a little exercise goes a long way the older you are. That I mentioned socialization being important, and such things as, in my book, I talk about the Harvard Grant study, that is a longitudinal study of men in the Harvard class of 1946, I think. Well, they're now, of course, very older men, the ones that are still living. But one of the things that one of the factors of successful aging in men is interaction with younger men, with younger people. It is very important. And in fact, George Valiant, Dartmouth's psychiatrist, says that one of his 8 factors for successful aging for older men is contributing to the growth of younger people. I found that fascinating and made me look at my own life and how many younger people I'm still connected to, and how much I deeply value those times when they call me, usually for a letter of recommendation for a job they're trying to get, and how much I get out of that, or how much I enjoy living we live in a neighborhood that is going through a kind of renaissance. It's a neighborhood that began in the early 1930s. Well, it's going through its fifth or sixth revival with young families. And I've noted how much my wife enjoys knowing younger women and younger mothers and their children, and how much interaction they have. In fact, over Christmas break, one of the young women called my wife and said, "Can I borrow a cup of bourbon from you? I'm doing that. I've got people coming over. I thought I had a dessert." And Patsy said, "Oh, I think we do have a cup of bourbon." "Yes, you can." Said, "Oh, thank you. I'll pay you right back." I said, "No." Anyway, I told Patsy, I said, "Wow, that's revealing that this young woman would think of you first as a source for a cup of bourbon." I think that says a lot about you, and so, but it also calls into question some of our patterns for aging. For instance, do we basically segregate the aged? In Durham, one of our major industries in Durham, North Carolina, is retirement centers. And we have two huge retirement villages, they call themselves, and they are virtual villages. Well, the research shows, pros and cons to that. That there can be this positive to be with people you have things in common with, and things that have been studies, for instance, done of Masonic homes, where Masons and their spouses and all can retire to, and that seems to have a positive effect. Sometimes people retire to retirement communities with people who share their religious beliefs, and that seems to be positive, to be with people of similar values. On the other hand, it also, there are losses about being in a place where everybody is the same age demographic. Not only that, but also of the same economic demographic. One thing is that these patterns of building and maintaining these very fine retirement centers. I know one here in town has a bowling alley, a huge pool, a bar, cafes. That probably is not sustainable. And it's important to remember that's available only to a small portion of the aging population. And in fact, in my book, I note that be suspicious sometimes of these positive accounts of aging. Whether your aged years are positive or negative, money is a huge factor in that. And and there are huge gaps in the way people age, mainly due to economic factors. And economic disparities suffered in your working life and all, they become greater during the aging years. And so I think it's important to be honest about that. Just to say, though, that I'm a pastor and teach in a seminary, preparing pastors. So I do try to explore the role religious communities can play in successful aging. And that is that for many people, their religious community is a major area of socialization. For many of us, church is the only thing we're involved in where we really get to be with other generations. I remember when I was serving a church here in Durham for a time, a young woman said that she'd visited a couple times. And so I said to her, we hope you'll join our church. She said, oh, I think I will. And I said, let me ask you, what's attracted you to this church? And she said, gray hair. And I said, my gray hair? And she said, well, maybe, but, and she said, I miss my grandmother so much. And I am stuck in an apartment complex where everybody is my age. And that means they're as dumb about life as I am. And then I work in a tech startup company here where everybody is my age and they're as dumb about life as I am. I'm looking for gray hair. I'm looking for wisdom. And I said, have you come to the right place? We have a surplus of aunts and uncles here in this church. I'm gonna line them up. You pick out the ones you want to be your grandmother. I will force them to be your grandmother. Yeah, well, I say to churches, this is a resource that needs to be shared. And another aspect of that is that I think the view that in our culture, that you work hard in life and you save and work hard so that you can get to be 65. And then you get to be totally irresponsible. You get to be retired. You get to be non-productive. You get to have the attitude, hey, I raised my children, okay? I'm retired. I'm done. I think I could argue from a Christian point of view, that's kind of sick, that there is no retirement for being a Christian disciple. Your responsibilities continue, and maybe even your responsibilities increase as you're older when you got more time. And some of us have more resources financially than we've had before in retirement. So I think it's important for there to be a critique of some of the cultural images of aging and retirement. And then just finally to say that, let's be honest, one of the reasons that aging is the source of a lot of deceit, a lot of false narratives, a lot of very negative narratives and all, is that the aging is moving toward the chief task of aging is dying. We're in the last quarter, the last fifth, the last eighth of our lives. And in aging, you have multiple opportunities to realize I'm terminal. This does not go on forever. There will be an ending. And so aging in a way becomes a test of your philosophy of life, a test of your character. Do you have the kind of character that can deal with the fact that you are ending and terminating? And John Wesley, I'm a Methodist, and John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, used to say, our people know how to die. Our people die well. And Methodists used to publish these deathbed testimonials of people where the grandmother would be dying and she'd call in all the family and she'd give them her final words of wisdom. And these would be written down and these would be published. It's kind of sad that most people in our culture hope that we'll die without knowing that we're dying. We hope it will be quick, and it'll be so quick that we won't actually know that this is it. The truth is, very few of us get to die that way. And it's kind of sad because we lack anything to do with our finitude, with our dying. What is the wisdom we've learned that we would share that a new generation needs to hear? Well, to me, that, and it's a prejudiced Christian comment on the kind you'd expect me to make, but that's a call for reflection. a call for the church to say, this life is preparation for this life being over. What's next? What does it all mean? What have you given your life to that's valuable? What have you learned that needs to be shared with a coming generation? What gifts do you have right now that should be given to others? Because as a Christian, that's one thing we think we are supposed to do. And I know as a pastor, the vast amount of volunteer work, the vast amount of giving into the community of time and talent and money came from people over 65 in my church. And that's a beautiful testimonial to what aging can be. Well, I'm going to stop there and see if we've got questions or comments.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. I really enjoy listening to you. You could just keep talking. I would just be
I'm
here.
glad you can make it through my accent.
I love the accent.
You're Canadian and you think you don't have an accent, and that's great. And
no, I know that I do. Canadian accent, though, across Canada, our accents change as well from the the West.
It
so
does.
There it is. We don't have any questions in chat box yet, but I do have a couple of questions for you myself. I love that you said that aging becomes a test of philosophy, of our life philosophy. I'm just wondering, for people who may be listening, who are not sure what their life philosophy is, do you have advice for how they would discover that?
Well, I think aging is a time of accountability, a time of reckoning. That's one reason a lot of us fear aging. And I remember the man who said to me, I just am in terror of having to get up in the morning and think of a reason for living. What do I do? And also he said, I drink too much, and all principally because I don't want, he said, I got some bad memories that come flooding back to me when I am quiet and sedate and alone. Wow. That's, so it's a time of reckoning. But I think all of us, in a sense, have a philosophy of life that we're busy living. A lot of times we're not very reflective about it. We don't acknowledge it. But maybe this is a call to say, hey, it's a time to ask yourself what's important. For instance, I've noticed among men in my church, if the work you're doing, your job, is your most important thing in life from which you receive most value, a reason for being, wow, you could have some tough going in retirement. You're going to have to find a new reason for being. But for many people in retirement, it becomes a time when you realize, gosh, I don't know that I enjoyed my job, my work that much. I'm glad to be done with it. I'm glad to be over with it. Now I can do some things that my job would not let me do. Now I can, and that sense of freedom and reclaiming. I remember the professor who asked me upon his retirement, he said, can you recommend a good Bible study book guide, something serious that will really help me dig in? And I said, my goodness, I didn't know you had a big interest in studying the Bible. And he said, I did. And then I had to put all that aside and launch out in my career. And I had so much other reading to do. But now I can read what I want to read. And could you recommend me something? Well, I think that in a sense, maybe his time, his retirement was a time of joyful reclamation of his true philosophy of life that he'd kind of had to put on the shelf, you know. But I think it also too, as a pastor, you know, to say to people, gosh, you better think about it now. You will get wrinkles if you're lucky enough to live past 65. You will experience diminishment in your body if you're lucky enough to live past 65. How would you handle that? And so it is one thing that aging can be is the gift of time to reflect and to synthesize and all. For some people, that can be a very painful experience, though.
Yeah, I appreciate that idea of reflection, of looking back in order to look forward and having an understanding of where they're coming from. I'm thinking of people who I know who have lived lives where they've not made great choices, or they are looking back on their lives and thinking, oh, I kind of wasted my time. Do you think it's ever too late to change?
It's never too late to change. I think I got some research backing me up on that. In fact, I think we ought to think of aging. One of the chief tasks of aging is change. I know years ago I had a young seminarian telling me that he was just miserable at the little rural church he was serving. And he said, you know, I said, tell me about the church. He said, well, it's your typical rural Methodist church. It's just full of old people. And said, you know how old people are. And said, and I said, how are they? He said, you know, stuck in their ways, creatures of habit. They don't want to try anything new. Well, God had given me an article that I happened to have read the week before on aging, among other, and the article said of the 10 of the 5-6 worst things that happen to you in life, half of them happen after 65. The death of a spouse, the loss of a job, the loss of freedom or mobility, etc. Well, so I said to him, you know, maybe it's not that these older people are stuck in their ways. It may be that they're being battered by some of the greatest changes they've ever had to make in their lives. So the last thing they want is to come to church and have some young preacher say to them, hey, folks, let's try something different today. Let's throw out all the music we've had from the past and bring in new music, or let's do this or that or the other. You know, maybe one of those older women would say, you try burying a man that you have spent 40 years of your life with. I'm sorry, that's just about all the innovation I can handle this month, okay? And so I think not only is it possible to learn things in our aging years, but we have to, we're forced to. I know one of the things I like was I read someone saying, you shouldn't say, you know, I once had a job, but then I retired and I lost the job. Better to say, I once had this job and I liked that job a lot, but then I retired and God gave me a new job. And now I've got a new job and I go to this job now, 4 days a week or whatever. And it's at the local school where I'm tutoring, or, you know, and so, and I do find, I remember the woman who told me she had a stroke right after she retired, and I said, gosh, I was praising her for her adaptability and her positive attitude and seeing the stroke as a new challenge. And she had physical therapy to do and all. And she said, in my work, I moved 20 times in 40 years. And she said, I became an expert in adaptation, transformation. I had to reinvent myself in my job 4 or 5 times. And I said, wow, I love to see you utilizing that now in this challenge. And I've noted, for instance, if you are an idea person, if you're kind of an intellectual kind of person and enjoy ideas and all, your aging can be a wonderful time. In fact, the studies show that that's one of the things that grandchildren give us during our aging, is that grandchildren are constantly feeding to us new insights and information and forcing us to say, I have to think about that, or wow, is that what your generation is thinking now and doing? Oh, and so you can teach an old dog new tricks.
I love that. I also love that there's a balance there and understanding that there is so much change taking place that when people are resistant to change, it's because they've experienced so much. I think that's good for all of us to keep in mind. So we had a question come in from Tiffany. Tiffany says, hello from North Carolina. Do you, right, all over the place, here we are. Do you see volunteerism and work within the church as a way to combat aging or the loneliness associated? Aging is a blessing, a sign of wisdom. I appreciate your breakdown on Ecclesiastes.
Absolutely, Tiffany. And I think, again, I say to churches, like I recommend, a nice thing would be when pastors hear that somebody is retiring or going through a life change in aging, to say, okay, what are you going to be doing for Jesus now? How will you live out your discipleship now? And I'm working on a book for Methodists, and I was remembering at a former church that we'd lost touch with our neighborhood. We were trying to get back in touch with our neighborhood. There was an elementary school across the street, and I took the principal out for lunch, and we were talking about some of the challenges, and he was talking about some of the difficult home situations that children came from. And I said, what would you do if I delivered you 5 mostly retired school teachers, vetted, experienced? What if I gave them to you? How could that boost your tutoring program? And he said, that would be amazing. Where would you get them? I said, I got them. Well, I left there and I went and I called up half a dozen people in my church. All of them had to be women, retired school teachers. Anyway, we ended up getting an award a year later from the school district. They blew in there, and as one of them said, I'm so much better after school tutor than I was as a teacher. And now I can teach like I wanted to teach. I'm this tutor. And so volunteering is very important. And since Tiffany is from North Carolina, I don't know where Tiffany's from, North Carolina, but I'm sure she's heard of our Duke basketball coach who just retired, Coach Mike Krzyzewski. But I was at a Duke retirees luncheon, and this is where people who work for Duke University, they had a monthly luncheon or something. And Coach Krzyzewski was the speaker. And Coach Krzyzewski said, I got friends that have a basketball team, and most of the young men on their team have never met their fathers. The American family is in sad shape. you are needed. He said, I look around this room and I just see wisdom here. I see people who were the best of their field, whether it was plumbing or nuclear physics or whatever you did in the university. You were marvelous. You contributed so much. And then he kind of paused for effect and he said, now look, people, you owe us something. Durham has been good to you. And he says, on every table, there is a sheet of paper and a pencil. And you fill out on that sheet of paper how you're going to pay back this town for the good things it gave to you and your family. And he said, I can help you find a position that needs you. And he says, if some of y'all are sitting there and you have nothing to put down on that paper, and you better check yourself out. Anyway, it was a coach speaking. But when he finished, on the way out, I said to him, Coach, you really are a Catholic, aren't you? I said, you're a Catholic down deep. That seems so Christian. And I just thought that sense of taking responsibility. And so, yeah, Tiffany, I think churches could do so much more to see the aging years as time for opportunity. And as Coach K said in that presentation, if your biggest concern right now is your golf tee off time, that's sick. That's sick. He said, I can give you something more important to care about. Anyway,
so we had a couple of more thoughts. Tiffany just said that she's in Union County and she has heard that coach before. And Amy says, thank you for having him talk about aging. Definitely some pearls of wisdom here. And I agree with that. I love that you spoke about the coach having them write down what they had to offer, because I was even thinking of, if we have listeners, if we have people in the world who just don't know what they have to offer, they don't know that they have a story, they don't know what gifts they have, what advice would you give them? What would you tell them? I think you kind of partially answered that with the coach question, but is there anything you'd add to that? If somebody says, I just, I'm retired now, or I'm in my older years and I just don't know what I have to give.
I think, again, I'm a pastor, but talking, but I think this is one of the responsibilities of the church, is to help people discover their gifts, whether young or old. And that a basic kind of Christian question is, what has God given you and how can that be a gift for others? And, for instance, sometimes aging gives you the gift of time, patience. Many older people find it difficult to do various demanding physical activity, but they can use the telephone. Like I know during the pandemic, a Baptist preacher in Richmond, Virginia was telling me, he said, all of our homebound people, anybody with COVID gets a call from the church every day. And I said, what? How did that happen? He said, oh, we got about a dozen retired people, and we give them phone list, and said most of the time they call. Said one of the women says that when she calls, most of her calls last about 30 minutes. But said others they just call, check on you, and said if they get any interesting information, like I've had a fever for 2 days, they feed that back into us, and we try to respond. Wow. So there's a lot that can be done. I know my life, it was infinitely formed by my grandmother, who my mother worked and didn't come home till like 5 o'clock. Well, I got out of school at 3 o'clock. Well, I went to my grandmother's house, and I can still remember sitting there with my grandmother, and she would tell me stories about the family. And she would say to me things like, you see, in our family, we never vote Republican for the following reasons. And I said, well, what if I want to vote Republican? She said, you will not desire that, dear, because you're in this family and we look at things very differently than the Republicans. Anyway, but I remember, I realized that that was the only adult in my life that had time to sit down and waste an afternoon talking to a 6-year-old. Well, that's a gift. And I was amazed at the Duke students. I was a college chaplain for 20 years. At the Duke students who would say things like, yeah, I call my grandmother every day. Or I remember the student who came into class said, well, it'd be interesting to see, said, just for your information, said, my grandmother was pissed about what you said in class last week. I said, your grandmother? How would your grandmother know what I said in class last week? Because I called her right afterwards. She never got to go to college, but she's one of the smartest people I've ever known, and said she has bought 2 of the books for this class and is reading it. So I have to keep her up with things. And said, I think my grandmother thought you were full of shit last week. And I said, whoa, I mean, I want to meet this woman. Anyway, isn't that amazing? You know, and I think I've said this in sermons. I don't think God created people to age without grandchildren. And I don't think God created people to grow up without grandparents. And so if your grandparents are halfway across the country, I think it's my responsibility to find you some grandparents closer by. And likewise, if you have no grandchildren around, the church could be a great place to help you find those. Well, here, our time is running out here, but is there one last thing we can talk about, Jim?
I love your insights, and I really feel that there's an element of aging that requires bravery, that it requires courage to see the gifts that you have, to see where you can step in, and to ask the questions, to say, where can I help? And so I love that you've given some really practical advice and wisdom and shared that wisdom with us. Okay, I have a couple of questions left.
I love that. I think I neglected that. I love the courage. I love your invocation of courage, and you're absolutely right that for many, and I must say I've noted with some people will say things like, I can't go on living without my husband. My husband was my life. I realized how much of my life I lived through him. Well, I would remind that person a year later, after she had moved, found a new life for herself. I said, let me just correct you on one thing, if I may. You presented yourself as a person who lacked courage. I have seen a brave person in you this year. And so I love that stress on courage.
I love that call out. I think that sometimes one of my philosophies is that if you see something, you say something. And often we think in terms of negative things. And if you see someone abusing someone else, you say something, which is true, and we need to do that. But I also think it's true that when we see the bravery in people, when we see the ways that they're using their gifts, or when we see gifts, that we call it out, and then regardless of whatever age they are, that they can receive that. So for you, I really appreciate the way that you articulated your thoughts. You're joining us today. It has been a pleasure. And I have to ask, we asked our presenters a couple of questions. First of all, McDonald's or Taco Bell? I'll break it down. Burgers or tacos? Let's go with that. Maybe McDonald's is a place.
I'm not a big fan probably of either, but I do love the McDonald's breakfast sandwich. What is
Okay,
that called?
I
Yeah,
love that.
yeah, okay, good. All right.
And would you prefer the beach or the mountains? If you're going on vacation, beach or mountains?
Both. And that sounds ambivalent, but I'm a
Yeah.
Methodist and Methodist are ambivalent on just about everything. But no, we were at the beach last week in North Carolina, and it was wonderful. It's one of the blessings of living in North Carolina. And I'm headed to the mountains on Saturday. It's the beach is pretty special, and particularly maybe at this time in life, it's weird as you're aging, to be around vastness and to realize, wow, I'm leaving, but this endures, and that's in a weird kind of way comforting.
I love that. I love the idea of this endurance. And I think that there's some people, they've talked about the U-shaped curve of happiness, that in middle age, we look at the vastness and think, oh, that endures. That's so big. And I can't fathom that. And I love that thought that as you age, that becomes more comforting. That's a wonderful thought. So for you, you mentioned that you are writing a book currently. When is that book coming out? When can we get our hands on that?
Well, I don't know. It's for Methodist.
Oh, okay.
So you don't want it. You don't need it.
Well, if you write any more book on aging, I will get my hands on it
Well,
right
good.
away.
And I appreciate your kind comments about the book. Thank you.
I really appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for your time. That finishes our time together. And thank you for everyone who's joined us today. Thank you again, Dr. Willimon. It has been a pleasure to hear your insights, and I will likely go back to your book and read it again. I need to buy the physical copy so that I can highlight it, because there were things that just stood out to me. I've recommended your book to so many people.
Oh,
honestly.
thank you.
So I really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.